Welcome, friends, to the last segment on wars. So, we have till now discussed about the definition of war, the nature of war, the causes of war, and now we are going to discuss the types of war. The first category in this is hegemonic wars. Hegemonic wars, by the name itself, it is very clear that these are the wars where a certain power or maybe a combination of powers at the same time decide to dominate and hegemonize over the world. And in their quest for domination, in their for hegemony, they end up leading the world to a situation where there is a major war. For example, the World War II was the last such hegemonic war where a combination of countries, a group of countries were trying to hegemonize over the world and dominate over the international system. Another kind of war is a war which is known as total war, where the purpose is of the aggressor to reach the capital of the other country and to capture it and to force the surrender of that country. So you want total surrender of the adversary. That is the purpose. For example, in the 2003 Iraq war, so that was the purpose, to force the other country to surrender totally. Similarly, in the World War II, that was the purpose of the aggression, for example, which Hitler embarked upon, whereby he was trying to attack the other country and capture the capital. He attacked France, he also attacked Britain, he attacked the Soviet Union. So the purpose was a total capitulation of the adversary. So when you have a certain adversary or maybe a certain group of adversaries as your target, usually it is one adversary at a time. Hitler was different. So you want to ensure that that adversary surrenders to you unconditionally, totally, and that is the purpose of your military incursion. So that kind of a war is known as total war. Then the third category is limited war. This is a war which is very clear by the name itself that the purpose is very limited. You have a limited objective, and once that objective is attained, the hostilities are ceased. There is cessation of hostilities. For example, the 1991 US-led war against Iraq. So US had a certain purpose, that Iraq should be ousted from Kuwait. So once that purpose is attained, the war is stopped because that is a certain objective. For example, in today's world, we see a lot of limited attacks, being carried out mostly by the United States of America and some other countries also, that they go and attack a target, Maybe they are saying that this is a terrorist training facility located in Syria, they go and attack it, and that's all. They go and attack some other terrorist groups in some region of Pakistan, maybe some other parts of Somalia, or in some other country of the world. So the purpose of that small war or a short war is very limited, and once that purpose is attained, it is called off. So it is not to take it to the ultimate point. So the war effort is not taken to a final ultimate point, but there is a certain limited objective, and once that objective is attained, the hostilities are terminated. Then a very prominent or a very frequently occurring kind of war in today's world, which is the most frequent type of war in the world, is the civil war. It is a broad category in which conflicts happen between factions within the territory of a state. As we discussed last time, that since the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, the world we live in, we have seen that the interstate war, means wars in which states are the main players, those kinds of wars have become less and less. We are witnessing less number of interstate wars. but wars which happen within a state, which is known as intra-state war. Intra means within the state. So these wars which happen within the boundaries of a certain state might spill over to maybe some neighboring states as well. They are known as civil wars. And the purpose sometimes is to change the system of government. For example, there is a system of government which is, say, which they claim to be democratic, and there is some group which wants to establish a military dictatorship there or some other form of government. So a violence conflict will ensue and the attempt will be made to change the system of government. Or sometimes the purpose is only to replace a certain government. So if there is one government in power at that point of time, the effort of another group is to replace this government. They are not satisfied with that particular government for maybe a variety of reasons. So they use violence to replace that government. So that is also something, a situation which is known as a civil war, because a war situation, a conflict, an exchange of hostility, use of weapons, sometimes even heavy weapons, takes place within the territories of a certain country where the actors are players within the territorial boundaries of a certain state. Sometimes it could even be, the purpose could even be to split a region of a state. Means some region is part of a country and you wage a struggle because you want to split that region out of that state. The classic example is that of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And there have been many other such conflicts where the purpose has been to split a region out of a state and create a new state. So for any of these reasons, or maybe a combination of two of these sometime, a conflict happens within the territorial boundaries of a country, and that is known as civil war. Then another category which is within the broad civil war category, but nevertheless slightly different, is guerrilla war. It is a war which again happens within the territorial boundaries of a state, whereby certain groups use these guerrilla warfare techniques, that is hit and run and then hide. So these groups are mostly underground, or they are dispersed among the population. You can't identify them because they are people of the same country, living in the same country. So they are like ordinary people, but they have a certain objective and they decide their targets and then they will hit state targets. Usually they are fighting against the state for whatever reason it might be, but they are basically trying to take advantage of their anonymity because they are less in numbers, obviously weak than the state. So they can't take the state head on. They can't fight with the state face to face because their potential, their capability is much less than the state. But they try to take advantage of their anonymity. They belong to the same country, so they know where to hide, how to hide, and when to come out and hit, and then they hide or merge with the local population. So such groups, have a certain advantage because even if the government has immense power or much more power than them at their hands, it can't use that power against them because it can't localize them. They mingle with the population. So the government or the state does not know where to use its force. So even if the state has much more power as compared to them, or its capability is much more comprehensive, but the state appears to be quite powerless in most situations. The other important thing is that these groups who do guerrilla warfare, they operate among the people, they win over a lot of people, especially in the hinterland or in the rural areas or among the tribals, and these people support them because they claim to be fighting for them. So therefore, they have a lot of local support also, and that's the reason why it's very difficult for the state to catch them, apprehend them, or to even exterminate them. Like the Naxalites operating in different parts of the country, and today Naxalism has become a very serious menace in our country, where the area of their operations is constantly expanding, and the government of India considers Naxalism as one of the serious threats to national security of the country. So to counter such groups like Naxals and other kinds of groups in India and elsewhere in the world, the government, what it does, it starts counterinsurgency by the state. So that is what these people are doing is insurgency. They are rising up against the state. And what the state does is it starts counter-insurgency, means to counter them. And what the state does is that it doesn't straight away go and use force, but it first tries to win the people who are in those areas where these insurgents operate, so that these people can be convinced and they can be brought on the side of the government. The government also announces a lot of economic packages also, because it is basically because of economic reasons that these people are so financially hard pressed that they go on supporting these groups. So the government wants to win them over, woo them, to ensure that these people no more support such insurgents. And that makes the task of the government easier to locate these people and finally then to neutralize them, or maybe even to have some channels of communication with them to convince them, to bring them to the mainstream, and to to ensure that these people shun violence and come to the civil society as peaceful citizens of that country. So there is insurgency in the states, and these insurgents use guerrilla warfare tactics to fight the state and its instruments, and the government does counter-insurgency to neutralize them physically, psychologically, and even emotionally. Then there is terrorism. Now terrorism is not a type as far as in war, or type of war, but of course it is something where violence is used. It differs from other kinds of war, of course, but since violence is used, so we need to mention it here, when we are talking about the different types of war, because terrorism is a phenomena where there is the use of political violence. And here the targets, unfortunately, are civilians, and it is a very deliberate attempt to target civilians. And that too, the target is very indiscriminate. So the terrorists would use violence indiscriminately among the civilian population or on the civilians and create a havoc in that country. They probably have an objective of drawing attention to their issues, and they think that by doing such acts of cruelty and violence, they might be able to draw the attention of that government and maybe sometimes the international community to the issues which they want to flag. So therefore, although this is what they do, but it is very difficult, in today's world to exactly define what terrorism is, because terrorism is something which is politically motivated. So sometimes it is very difficult to decide, who is a terrorist, because one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. For example, when the Britishers were ruling over India, so our people, Indians, who were fighting the Britishers, and some of them were even using force, They used to go and bomb places and use violence and kill British officers and things like that. But those were our freedom fighters. So for Indians, they were freedom fighters, they still are. But for the imperial British government, they were terrorists. So the British government and their records used to call them terrorists, but for us, they were our freedom fighters. So the same thing operates in other parts of the world. And that's the reason why we have this very catchy dictum that one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. However, terrorism is a shadowy world of faceless enemies, and there is the use of irregular tactics, means the tactics are not defined, they can do anything and everything, and it is marked by extreme brutality. So sometimes, and most of the times, of course, you are shaken by the brutality and by the extreme brutality which terrorist actors resort to, but that is how they operate. So therefore, they are, a faceless enemy, but a very dangerous enemy, or one of the most dangerous enemies for civil society anywhere in the world. And there is another important category in this which comes to further complicate the understanding of terrorism or the definition of terrorism, and that is a state-sponsored terrorism, or a state-sponsored terrorists, where state actors, as a matter of their national policy, would go on and support terrorist groups. We in India have faced a lot of terrorism, and most of these terrorist groups in different parts of India have been very openly being supported by foreign governments. So that is the kind of terrorism where all the material help and all the resources are channelized through different sources from a foreign government, and they, to fulfill some of their foreign policy agenda, use these terrorist groups. And that makes this situation even more dangerous because there is a continuous supply of resources and manpower from a state actor, and therefore it becomes very difficult for the state, which is at the receiving end of this kind of a terrorism, to finally exterminate this kind of a terrorist group or these kind of forces of terrorism, and to handle them, or rather neutralize them in some way or the other. Then at the international level, we see some very powerful countries of the world creating different terrorist groups, to further their foreign policy objectives. In Afghanistan, in the war where Afghanis were fighting against the Soviets, there were the groups of Taliban who were supported by America, and they were supported very strongly. And when the Soviets eventually withdrew from Afghanistan, the same Taliban were branded as terrorists by the Americans and the Western governments. So it was a group which was actually created by the West. But finally, when this group they were not able to handle them, or they were not able to give them a cause to continue fight for them, and they probably started fighting against their interests in some part of the world, then they started being labeled as terrorists. So states play a very dirty game, in international politics today, when they sometimes think that the easy route for the attainment of certain foreign policy objectives for them is to go and support a terrorist group. And in the long run, they all have to face a lot of difficulties, but by that time, when you realize that what you did was wrong, it is a bit too late. So that again, further complicates the issue of terrorism as a phenomena in international politics. And that is the reason we have not been able to agree to a universally accepted definition of terrorism even till date. Now, after this discussion of the types of war, we also need to understand about the theoretical framework, which talks about war in the form of the just war theory. And just war theory talks about what is a just war, because their argument is that we should not live in an ideal world. We should be living in a real world. And in a real world, wars are bound to happen. But if wars are bound to happen, we should understand that what is a just war, or how war is to be fought. So therefore, they are talking about the right to war. But what are the limitations of this right to war? That is discussed by this theory. It is about the conditions that must obtain to determine whether a resort to war is just or unjust. So the question which confronts us is that how do we know that it is right to embark on war A or not to embark on war B in a different situation? So there are some conditions which are given by the just war theory. The first condition is that it should be a just cause. What does a just cause mean? This is about having appropriate reasons to go to war. Such reasons could be self-defense. It could be the protection of a sovereignty of a state, especially in terms of aggression, or unjust occupation, or even self-determination. The other condition is proportionality. The question here is that whether the warfare would be commensurate or match with the actions or activities that trigger the war. For example, if some state is attacked by another state and some damage is done here, but what this state does in return and goes and does a bombing campaign on the other country which demolishes, a large section of the territory of that country. So that will be known as a disproportionate response. The classic example has been all through in Israel, where whenever the people living in Gaza, who are the original inhabitants of Palestine, whenever they have resorted to any kind of provocative action, of course, it's not to defend that, the state of Israel has resorted to collective punishment. And the most serious and heinous kind of collective punishment is underway in the present times, where all the people are being punished who live in Gaza for the acts of a limited number of people who happen to, of course, belong to the same territory. So, what this theory says that it should not be unproportionate response. It should be very proportionate to the provocation. The third condition is that there should be a reasonable chance of success. The concern here is that the likelihood of war bringing about the desired or desirable just end should be there. It is important to know that if the war will end up with the injustice it seeks to correct. So what you are seeking to do, because if you are sure before you go to start a war that there is no reasonable chance of success, you will not be able to end this injustice A which is happening in some part of the world, you should not go to war. So there should be some logical, reasonable chance, of success. Then the actor which is going to war should have a legitimate authority. In practice, only the heads of government in any country have the legitimate authority to order or motivate war against another state, or sometimes against some non-state aggressor even. But that should be a legitimate authority. Then there is a right intention clause also. This concerns the moral side of the cause, which is probably best interpreted as the motives behind the reasons. For example, a reason for war may be to depose a despotic ruler that constantly indulges in breach of human rights. But it would count as unjust if the underlying motive is actually to create a state of chaos and gain express access to the resources of that state. So that happens many a time in the world, that the powerful countries of the world, tend to do this, because their eye is basically on the resources of that state. The classic example is Iraq, that America and its allies were basically eyeing the oil resources of Iraq, and the excuse was to depose a despotic ruler who ironically happened to be their ally for decades. And suddenly they realize one fine morning that this person is breaching human rights and he is despotic, and therefore he has to be ousted. So that is, the right intention here is apparently right, but actually it is not. And then an important condition here is that it should be the last resort. Here, the point is that the war which you are going to embark upon should be the last option to consider. After the state intending to go to war has actually exhausted all other options to respond to a certain provocative situation. Such options could include diplomatic talks or using judicial options, the international community, International Court of Justice, International Human Rights Court, and institutions like these. And finally, there should be the public declaration of war. The last among the conditions of just war is that the intention to go to war after the other conditions have been granted should be made public. There should be no covert war or some sort of a secret sabotage or conflict. Perhaps the reason here is that the international community should be aware of the war and able to judge the justness of that war, or to know how or whether they need to intervene in that situation at that point of time or maybe sometime in future. Another important aspect of the just war theory is justice during the war. Means when the war starts, there are also a lot of concerns of justice. It is about the conditions that must obtain to judge if an ongoing war is just or unjust. Nonetheless, the rules guiding conduct in war, especially on the nature of permitted weapons, treatment of prisoners of war, and in international legal conventions like the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907 conventions, or the 1948 Geneva Conventions, or its 1977 protocols. As we shall notice, most of these conditions are prohibitions and restraints in war. We would talk about 4 such conditions here. The first condition is qualifying as combatants. An important point in just war theory is that warfare is normally only for combatants. Combatants are regular forces, who are fighting the war, who are identified as soldiers or combatants or those linked with them. And there is need to separate these combatants from non-combatants, because war is to be fought between, combatants on one side and combatants on the other. So non-combatants, that is civilians, women, children, ordinary people, they all should be excluded from the warfare. So that is something very important here. The other thing is identifying legitimate attacks. It is required that combatants who are fighting the war should identify those who are liable to or justified for being attacked. So they should avoid, intentional attacks on non-combatants, either in terms of hostage taking or torture or killing. All these things have to be avoided. Thirdly, there should be legitimate targets. This condition links with the previous one, which we talked. It is that although we have identified those who are liable to legitimate attacks, this is not a sanction to indiscriminately attack those deserving such attacks. So there are acceptable and unacceptable means of attacking those legitimate targets. To consider a tactic as legitimate, we should be able to identify whether the attack is necessary to achieve your military objective. For example, for destroying a military air base, if it is necessary that a bridge which is there has to be demolished, or it is something which you are doing just because you want to inflict damage on the adversary. Then proportionality is also an important element of legitimate military tactics. It is the harm that one inflicts must be proportionate to the good that is protected, and must be the least harmful means for achieving of that particular good. For example, bombing some factories that produce war materials for the enemy combatants must be proportionate to quell a threat of aggression, rather than killing the enemy combatants. So that is something, which we need to ensure, when we are going for war. And of course, biological, nuclear, chemical weapons, which are prohibited to be used under international legal conventions of war, they obviously need not be used, And then there is the treatment of prisoners of war. Prisoners of war may also include combatants who were injured and then thereby they were incapacitated during the fight, or those who were captured, or those who voluntarily surrendered. So that is, and as we are seeing every day in the recent ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, this is a very serious concern, how we need to treat the POWs. And then finally, after the war has concluded, the just war theory also talks about the justice after war. It is about the conditions that should be in place to end a war and what follows in a just war. The first thing is rebuilding, This is the effort of restoring destroyed institutions, structures, and facilities that are significant for after-war peace building. Then next is retribution. This is the condition concerning paying back aggressors or unjust contributors to war. Retribution as a condition does not only entail punishment, but it also concerns the measurement of the punishment to be met out to unjust aggressors. So it's not that you just punish them indiscriminately. And the classic example is the Treaty of Versailles, where such extreme conditions were put on Germany, and many people understand that those were the reasons which led Hitler to become so popular in Germany, and whereby Germans were brought to support his war policy, and which eventually led to the Second World War. And the third is reconciliation. It is the process of returning previously warring parties to a point not only where they agree not to engage in violence towards each other, but also where there is sufficient trust so that a robust and just peace may be attained and established. Then there is restitution. During the war, it is likely that some properties or resources that rightfully belong to certain persons may be lost or taken away from them. Looting, for example, of resources is often a characteristic of war. Thus, restitution as a post-war condition is about returning the resources of properties to their owners, something which happened after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and a lot of properties or resources were returned to the original owners, which were looted by the invading Iraqi army. Then there is reparations. This is like another side of the coin, because it is also about restoration, but here it is about restoring damaged building during war, which were damaged to a good condition. So it suggests that it is mainly about wrongful harm from war. So whatever wrongful harm resulted from the war, it is usually a post-war attempt to address or to redress injustice to war victims. And then there is proportionality. Earlier we had talked about proportionality, and it was about whether the act of war will be commensurate or match with the actions or activities that trigger the war. But here the case is somewhat different. Here proportionality is to ensure that the efforts to establish peace do not cause more harm than good to the population concerned. So it is used to restrict excessive impositions by the victors on the victims. For example, if there would be an imposition of fines on defeated aggressors, it should not be excessive to the detriment of their survival. Again, the classic example is the terms of the Versailles Treaty. So therefore, we have seen some of the trends which constitute the just war theory. They were basically intended to make us understand that war is something which needs to be avoided, and then we also discussed about the types of war, but war is something inevitable also. So eventually if war happens, these are the conditions which need to be followed by participants in a war situation. So that is all about our understanding about war and the different dimensions of war. Thank you.